All right, good evening and welcome to the gathering at Scott Memorial Home Edition. We're continuing our sermon series about what it's like to go on a journey with God through the wilderness. And tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of being bilingual on our journey. So how many of you are fluent in a language other than English? Just for curiosity's sake, you guys can post underneath this video what language you might be fluent in. If we had a group of people here in the room, statistically speaking, according to the Center for Immigration Studies, there are a whopping 618 million bilingual Americans in the U.S. right now. So 1 in 5 Americans knows more than one language. It's incredible, right? But at the same time that the number of people who speak more than one language is growing, it's also decreasing. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, in July of 2015, in a News and Observer report, it shared results and additional data from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and American Councils for International Education. So Congress asked for some data. They gave them that data, and according to everything that they researched since 1997 to 2008, when they last did their data, we've seen a massive drop in the amount of languages offered in our public schools. So if you look at middle schools, back in 1997, 75% of middle schools offered a foreign language class, and now 58% do. Elementary schools, it used to be 31% of elementary schools offered it. Now only 15% of public elementary schools have a foreign language. And it's easiest to learn languages when you're younger, and Europe has caught on to that miraculous fact. So Pew Research in that same month of July of 2015 talked about how in most European countries you begin studying a foreign language when you're between the ages of 6 and 9 years old. And there are 20 European countries that require you to learn a third language, and study it for at least a year before you've completed your studies in their country. So they are very firm believers in making people bilingual or trilingual, but that is not as important here in America. In fact, the Modern Language Association has been doing research since 1958 on the number of students that study foreign languages in higher education. And they said that number has dropped for the first time in 20 years. It's dropped by 7%. So why does that even matter? Why do we need to even learn another language? I'm so glad you asked. Because according to the National Institutes of Health from May of 2012, when you know more than one language, it improves your memory, it improves your ability to multitask, and at the same time improves your ability to have selective attention and focus on something when you need to. And so when I learned that, I am actively teaching my kids a second language now, because in this crazy fast-paced world full of technology, what better gift to give my kids than the ability to multitask and also focus and pay attention on one thing in a chaotic situation when I need to. So learning multiple languages can change your life. I studied languages growing up, but didn't speak a language fluently until after college. When my husband and I joined the Peace Corps, when I landed in Bulgaria, I did not even know that there were 30 letters in the Bulgarian Cyrillic alphabet. 2 years later, I was able to do radio interviews and publicly teach in Bulgarian. I was fluent. It was incredible and amazing, and it taught me the beauty not only of the Bulgarian language, which is so beautiful, but it also taught me the beauty of the English language, as I realized there are words in each language that don't necessarily translate the same way. And it helped me understand how hard it is for non-native English speakers to learn this language. It is so confusing. We have so many tenses. It is so difficult. And my ability to learn Bulgarian led me to try to study Greek when I was in seminary, which has also changed my life and my ministry. So learning other languages can be so deeply meaningful. So it's good for us mentally, but it's also good for us emotionally and spiritually. It helps us understand just the language of God, and more importantly, how this connects to faith. Comes from Philippians 3:20. It's one of the texts we're going to look at tonight. And in Philippians 3:20, we are reminded that we are citizens of heaven. And so you can wave your flag, you can be patriotic, but our status as I'm assuming a lot of you are American citizens. Whatever country is yours, that matters and that's important, but it should not be a priority over your citizenship in heaven. We belong to God. We belong to the kingdom of God, and we need to live like it. And the language of faith is so different from the language of the world around us, the language of the culture around us. And so what we need to be able to do is we need to know the language. There are 3 steps here when it comes to being bilingual. Step number 1 is to know your native tongue. And so that means that this incredible, exciting book, we need to be able to read it. We need to read it by ourselves. We need to read it in groups of people and study it. We have so many small groups going on. Our Broken Way study, which looks at scripture, the Teachings of Jesus study that Herc is starting here soon. So read this Bible, understand what it means to be a citizen of heaven. What is grace? What is salvation? How did the early church start? And how does that affect and shape the church today? We need to know how to talk about the things that really matter when it comes to knowing God and walking with God. So step number 1, know your native tongue. Step number 2 is learn your second language. Learn the language of the culture around you. I know growing up, some of you may have been in homes where like TV was forbidden and you could only listen to Christian music. But I'm actually, as a pastor, a big advocate of learning and knowing what are people reading, what are people watching. So when I heard my niece quoting Hamilton, the Broadway musical, I was like, wow, how do you get like a preteen to want to understand history? So I listened to it, loved it, and it taught me the power of rhythm and the power of a story that can really captivate someone and make them want to dive deeper and learn more. You watch different TV shows that everybody's raving about. You know, some of the TV shows that congregants have recommended to me have been Shameless or the movie Deadpool or Grey's Anatomy or Game of Thrones. And while I may not watch more than an episode or 2, it gives me an idea of how I can then connect with them or other people outside of the church that want to know more about my language of faith when it comes to those common issues of brokenness or stress or grief or fame. What do we do with that? How do we respond to that as citizens of heaven? So when the Oscars come out, I might watch some of the shows that are awarded either at the Oscars or at the MTV Movie Awards, right? Read the books. That's why we have a book study going on in the church. What are people reading? What's on the bestseller list? Let's read that for its own content, and then let's read that through the lens of faith and figure out what we can learn from it. So step 1, know your native tongue. Step 2, learn the language of the culture that you're in. And step 3 was a really incredible insight that I read in Richard Hayes' commentary on 1 Corinthians, which has a text we're going to look at in a few moments. And Richard Hayes says it's also important to know your power. Know your power, know your authority. What does that mean? Well, it's based on 1 Corinthians 9, 19 to 23, which says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. And my friends, the Apostle Paul, who wrote these words, was the master of language, right? He may have known actually multiple languages, but he could speak the language of faith. And he's talking here about 3 particular groups or types of people that existed back then, a lot of whom exist today as well. So the first group of people are the Jews, people under the law, and back then and even today in Judaism, they have strict rules and regulations for what to eat, what to wear, how to live your life. And Paul, being a Jewish scholar, understood all of that. And so when he was in a community with Jewish people, he would live under those rules and regulations, not because he had to, not because they applied to him necessarily, but because he wanted to speak their language so they would feel safe, they would feel respected. And when he lived and embraced the Jewish customs, he could say, hey, let me tell you about my Jewish friend Jesus. And it's a good segue into trying to help them understand who Christ was and what he was about. And then Paul says that he's also made sure that when he's with people who are not under the law, that he can live as one not under the law. So these are non-Jewish people, right? The biblical term is Gentiles. They're people that don't go to church, don't care about God, don't care about faith. And back then, in Paul's day in Corinth, these are people that live for the typical sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? They like to have a good time. And so when Paul was with them, he would go to the bar, he would have a beer, he would listen to their stories. And this is where it's important to know that language of the culture that you're in, but also know your boundaries. Because he would go to that bar, he'd have a beer and talk to him, but he would not get drunk and wasted. Because as a citizen of heaven, we need control over our bodies at all times. He might listen to their raunchy jokes or stories, but he wouldn't tell stories of his own, because that's not what a holy life looks like. You can listen to it. So he listened, he loved, he didn't judge, but he shared his point of view, what motivated him, what helped him find meaning and truth in life, and they listened. We see an example of Paul's ability to really reach out and understand the language of others in the book of Acts, when Paul is in Athens and he goes to the Areopagus and he sees this whole section of the city where they've erected all these statues and altars to all the gods and goddesses that they worshipped. And they had one altar that had a little plaque on it that said, "This is to an unknown God." And so Paul took that as an opening and said, listen, in your culture, you want to make sure no one's left out. So you have this altar here to an unknown God. Let me tell you who that unknown God is. Let me tell you the story of Jesus. So he found things in their culture that were connecting points that he could use to bring up the good news of Jesus Christ. So we have to know how to talk and to communicate in a way that is not judgmental, but in a way that is loving and grace-filled. And then I love it. It says that, Paul became like the Jews for the Jews. He became like those not under the law for those not under the law. And then it says, Richard Hayes draws attention to this in his commentary. It doesn't say he becomes like the weak to help the weak. It says he becomes weak. And that's interesting. So what's going on there? Earlier on in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul is saying, listen, I've had to say no to things that were my right. I mean, he was a Roman citizen. He could have had those churches paying him all kinds of money. And he brings it up. He's like, listen, I don't have to be working in a blue-collar profession as a tent maker, where if I don't work, I don't eat. I don't have to be doing this. You could be paying me. But I am going to become weak. I'm going to understand and identify with those who don't have that kind of option. And maybe there are some apostles and disciples traveling around with their wife, and I'm not doing that. I'm here by myself, working and doing my best to identify and to become weak, so that people who don't feel like they have rights, they don't feel seen, they don't feel known, will know that I see them and I can identify with them. Richard Hayes says, anytime you want to tell an American to give up their rights and become weak, you're going to become pretty unpopular in the church. And that's what happened to Paul. They didn't like it because we want to live into our power and our authority, but when you have true power and authority, you're willing, as a Christian, as a citizen of heaven, to relinquish it all if it's hindering you, if it's keeping you from that primary language of faith. So this might, before I close, I'm going to bring up a little question that might be bubbling to the surface in your mind of, okay, well, does this mean that Paul was some kind of hypocrite, that he was a fake? If he acts one way with the Jewish people and he acts another way with non-Jewish people and he acts another way with the weak, with the have-nots, then isn't he just a big phony? Like, who is Paul really? And that's a really great question. And the truth of the matter is, Paul was not fake or phony in any sense of the word. He had the same truths, the same identity, the same principles in every single context. But he realized the culture he was in and made it as easy as possible to be able to share his faith there. So if he was only around Jewish people, he was not going to invite them over to his house for a pork barbecue. It would be offensive. It would be rude. It would shut off that relationship. But when he was in mixed company, if there were Jews and non-Jewish people there, then he would live in the most inclusive and open way possible so that people did not feel threatened or judged by whatever it was they were feeling. So an example of this we can see, oh my goodness, I think it's in Galatians 2:11-13. And what happens there is Paul talks about a time when he and Peter, remember the disciple Peter, on you, Peter, I'm going to build my church. Like, Peter was one of the leaders of the church, and he and Paul went at it because Peter was hanging out with Paul in Antioch with non-Jewish people, eating with them, having fellowship with them. And then Jewish people came along, and Peter was like, oh, that's my posse. Like, I know them, I get them, I understand them. They're more like me. And so he stopped socializing and interacting. He stopped eating with the non-Jews so he could be clean and have the clean, appropriate, pure food with his Jewish friends. And Paul said, how dare you? You love everybody, and you need to be open and welcoming. You can't neglect them just because the Jewish group came along and you're afraid of being criticized or judged. You need to love all and continue to live into that calling of Christ with whomever it is that surrounds you. So my hope and prayer for all of us as Christians is we're figuring out what the language of faith is and how to learn this language, and then how to translate or interpret it for others, is that the words from Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 22 and 23 specifically, would really guide and inspire us. And those words, just to refresh your memory, says that we are called, my friends, to become all things to all people, so that by all possible means we might save some. We do all this for the sake of the gospel, that we might share in its blessings. So may everything you do and everything you are be for the sake of the gospel. And may, as a result of doing so, may you find yourself richly blessed. Have a great night, guys. See you next week.